Welcome to the Sound of Ideas from IdeaStream Public Media. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thank you for joining us for our live community tour show on property taxes. Our community tours bring us out of our studios at the Idea Center at Playhouse Square and into our community in person with our neighbors. Today, we're coming to you from the Cleveland Metro Park Zoo in front of a live audience. We are here to talk about property taxes, which generate more than $20 billion in tax revenue in Ohio each year. They help pay for public schools, emergency services, libraries, and even the Cleveland Metro Parks, which operates this zoo we're sitting in right now. Lately, some homeowners are feeling financial pressure from rising property taxes across the state, directly connected to property valuations that have gone up, including by an average of 32% in Cuyahoga County. This pressure is part of the reason some people are calling to reform or even abolish Ohio's property tax. Others think people simply shouldn't be taxed on property they've already paid for. The group leading the property tax ban effort, Axe Ohio Tax, failed to collect enough signatures in time to get their initiative on this November's ballot, but organizers are already looking ahead to 2027. If property taxes are reformed or completely eliminated, what would happen to the services that rely on that source of funding to operate? Would schools, police, and parks see funding cuts? Or could there be an alternative source of revenue? This summer, we've been holding listening sessions with voters at libraries across Northeast Ohio and have heard repeatedly that property taxes are one of the main issues on people's minds going into this pivotal upcoming election. That's why, for our latest week-long series, IdeaStream Explores, we landed on this issue, with our entire newsroom devoting coverage to it. You can find these stories on 89.7 FM WKSU, online at ideastream.org, and on our social media channels. Today, here at our community tour, our guests for this conversation are Frank Antonucci, Chief Auditor for Geauga County, and in that role, he assists the auditor in supervising millions in county funds, budgets, and financial reporting. Frank, thanks for being with us.
Thank you.
Also with us, we have John Plechnik, one of the leaders of the Axe Ohio Tax movement. He's also a tax law professor at Cleveland State University School of Law and a Lake County commissioner. John, welcome. Brian Zimmerman is the president and CEO of the Cleveland Metro Parks, one of the organizations who receive some of their funding through county property taxes. Brian, thank you for hosting us and being part of the conversation. Also with us, we have Pat Shipe. She's the president of the Akron Education Association. With school funding being a major component of the property tax conversation, we wanted to include the perspective of someone working in education. Pat, thank you for being that person for us.
Yeah, sure.
Not part of our panel today, but we do know Ohio State Senator Kent Smith is here representing District 21. We'll hear from Kent and maybe some other elected officials in the audience as the conversation progresses. Now, to all of you here with us now, we want all of you in on this conversation. Maybe you're a homeowner who's seen your home value go up. Maybe it's led to a property tax bill that you're struggling to pay. Maybe you're concerned about funding for your school district, your local library, or a service that you rely on. We want you to come up to the microphone, which you see in the middle of our aisle here, and you can ask a question or make a comment. We do ask when you come to the microphone, when we work you into the conversation, please say your name and where you're from, and we will do that. We will work you into the conversation as we can, as we now start that conversation. Frank, I'd like to start by asking, why do you think property taxes are such a mystery to so many people in terms of how they're calculated and what they pay for?
That's a great question, Stephanie. Let me start off by saying I've worked at the Geauga County Engineer's Office. I practice law privately. I served as a township trustee. I was elected by the voters in my community. Now I work at the auditor's office. And I think that it's a mystery for the taxpayers in terms of how property taxes are collected, what they mean, because it just is. I have no idea, and I've served in all of those capacities. I don't want to say that Columbus has intentionally made them complicated for us, but over time they have been very complicated. It's a nuanced position, but it doesn't make a lot of sense in how we get to that funding. So I think that one of the big issues we run into is that people don't understand how the funding is because it is opaque, it is complicated, and one of the things that could be added to this is a level of transparency that would help people understand where their property taxes come from, why they're paying them, and what they do.
Little baseline information for everyone in our audience. We know that 60% of all property taxes collected in Ohio go to public schools. The other 40% is distributed among local county, municipal, and township governments, and these funds support essential community services. Those services include police and fire protection, emergency medical services, road and bridge maintenance, public libraries, parks like the Cleveland Metro Parks, and county health departments, including services that the Cuyahoga County Department of Developmental Disability provides, to name one example. We have one representative from this group here with us, Brian. Brian, I'd like to ask you, can you talk about how much of the Metro Parks budget comes from property taxes?
Well, first, thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. You know, I think it's interesting when you look at, the history, and the City Club did a very nice job, just this past Friday talking through kind of the nuances. And I think, you have to be able to demystify your own tax bill, as it comes. And I think there's a lot of people that actually don't understand. I think it's interesting for, an organization such as ours here in Cuyahoga County. We operate on a 10-year levy cycle, and so 60% of our budget comes from the property taxes. The organization here that we're sitting in today at the zoo, when I first got here, we were subsidizing it by 76%. Now we're down to below 25%. And so we're finding very unique ways to be able to reduce that. But I think, the formulas by which we've arrived at over time, I think people are very happy when their valuations go up, but then they also realize that they have to pay something on that. So we really have to be looking at more solution-minded focuses, not just kind of something that happens kind of overnight. This didn't happen within the last 2 years. It's happened over quite a number of years. And I think the solutions need to come from real people that are affected by this in very, very unique ways. How to keep people in their homes, how to, again, provide value, how to be able to balance the teeter-totter so that we're not going too far one way or the other. But I think this is a very unique conversation that we're very proud to be part of.
Brian, I'd like to ask you a follow-up question about the conversation about reform or suggestions for elimination of property tax. How does that play into budgeting for the future for the Metro Parks for capital projects? Is that something that is a big part of those conversations?
Yeah, the best way to answer for us, unlike where there are some levies that are continual, that they just get voted on once and they just keep returning, we do not have that. We call it Sing for Our Supper every 10 years. And so every 10 years, we go back to the ballot. We passed this past levy cycle at 78%, the highest we believe in Cuyahoga County's history. Now, we have to provide value or we don't get that vote. And so having a vote at a local level still means something to us, but we're also very mindful of the homeowners that are stressed. And I think the balance that we're trying to find is an equalization factor of earned revenue in park spending. We do have golf courses that are not subsidized. We have a zoo that has some subsidy, but there are certain things that we wouldn't be able to do or continue. We also have, during the past when the Kasich administration was in, and they did the first kind of set of rollbacks, we laid off people for the very first time. So we've made hard choices before. We have 70 positions we've eliminated. We're trying to make sure that we've got the right balance of what we're doing, how we're doing it, and what the public hopes for us to deliver.
A historical note to bring into this conversation now, which came from reporting from IdeaStream's Jeff St. Clair, is that property taxes have shifted more toward homeowners and less on businesses over time. This hasn't always been such a responsibility of landowners specifically. If you didn't catch that reporting from Jeff St. Clair, you can catch that at ideastream.org. Now, Pat, when people think about property taxes, many of them draw a line to the funding of our public schools because of that 60% number I mentioned a moment ago. What is your reaction to the notion of reform or elimination? Is it a reaction of frustration? Is it an idea that this might be an opportunity to start over and more adequately fund schools, which we know has been a topic of conversation for a long time, the lack of adequate funding for schools? What do you think?
I agree that most people are confused about property taxes, but I would venture to say they're confused about the priorities and how they're spent. They believe that they're going to be taxed for properties. I I think that the biggest problem is the lack of information or misinformation regarding the schools. 10 years ago, the state's funding level for public schools in this state was at 60%. It's now on average at 35%. That's an incredible decrease in state funding. In addition to that, you'll have those that say, remember, the state has deemed property tax and reliance on property tax for school funding to be unconstitutional 4 times since 1997. So I think the public has been very clear about what they desire. The answer seemed to have been at one point the Fair School Funding Act, which was passed. And for 1 year, the Fair School Funding Act, which was actual cost per student to educate a student, was funded. And then the legislature saw fit to underfund it in a way that has sent close to $3 billion, that's billion with a B, to private for-profit schools, parochial schools, charter schools, and underfund our public schools by an incredible amount. I think the public is very confused on how that's working. And in addition to that, we have had untold, unfunded mandates toward public schools, which are accountable for what they spend. And those same unfunded mandates do not apply to private for-profit schools in many cases, nor are those private for-profit schools accountable for how they spend that close to $3 billion. So it's a problem of, I believe, the public not really realizing how the public schools have been starved for funding while they're required to give public tax dollars to private entities, for-profit entities, when our Constitution says that our legislature is to fund one common school system and not 4 parallel school systems, which they are doing now.
Thanks for sharing that perspective with us, Pat. John, I want to ask you about your group, Axe Ohio Tax. Your group is calling to get rid of property taxes entirely, which has resonated with some people. Why do you think that the group wasn't able to collect the signatures needed to get on the November ballot?
I think it's miraculous that this group has collected over 305,000 signatures without having a massive funding source or dark money PACs. This has been the biggest grassroots effort for a ballot initiative in Ohio that I have ever seen. To just post a PDF of petitions online with a YouTube video and say mail them into the P.O. box, and to get tens and tens and tens of thousands of signatures mailed from volunteers who haven't even signed up or joined an official club, just average citizens from across Ohio. I think it's miraculous that about half the signatures were collected so quickly, and I have little doubt that the full amount of signatures will be collected by 2027 if the state legislature fails to act first. I've famously said that a constitutional amendment is a blunt instrument. It does a lot of good, it does a lot of bad. It's not going to solve every problem because you can only put one issue on the ballot. The Ohio Constitution restricts a constitutional amendment to one single issue. So when people say, why not have a comprehensive solution for funding side by side with it, the answer is you can't have multiple issues on one amendment. But when the state legislature refuses to act to give property tax relief, when a supermajority of Ohioans aren't just asking, they're crying out for relief and help, it's not surprising to me that hundreds of thousands of signatures were collected, not by a political group or billionaires funding petition campaigns from other countries or states, but just average citizens who are desperate for relief. And the only tool they have to leverage the state to take action is to say, if you won't cut our property taxes, we'll take all the money back.
So was that a conscious choice then? And so it sounds like what I heard you say there is that the reason the signatures weren't able to be collected was the lack of backing from a PAC, the lack of backing of dark money. Was that a conscious choice?
I think that there was never a desire to make this political. I think this was always citizens coming together to make change in their community. I'm not aware of any efforts to seriously raise money or to reach out, just efforts to get signatures and to make change. Because that's what everyone is trying to do here. We're trying to find a solution to an overly complex system with a lot of disparities and negative externalities. There's no debating that Ohio is the 8th just about highest tax state for property taxes in the union, and taking all state and local taxes into account, we're about the 16th highest. So we're not getting the 16th best services in the country, but we're paying the 16th highest taxes. That gives us a pretty big margin for recovery as taxpayers. That leaves a lot of room for reform. And once again, I always say if you support abolishing property taxes, sign the petition and you'll have a chance to vote on it. If you don't support abolishing property taxes, sign the petition, and it'll force our state reps and senators to give us their last best offer before we take all the money back. But the worst case scenario for everyone, every taxpayer, is to leave the status quo in place, because we can't continue to tax seniors out of their homes. We can't continue to make new housing unaffordable for young families to come into Ohio. We can't be the sore thumb where our property taxes are substantially higher than our neighbors, because that means Ohio will slowly lose our population, will slowly shrink, and that's not what we want for our community. We don't want a long, slow march to irrelevancy for the state of Ohio. We don't want to lose our seniors to Florida, and we don't want to lose young families to more affordable places. We want to address this issue head on. And there are two ways to do it. We can flip the table and start fresh. That's what the constitutional amendment gives us a chance to do. Or if the state legislature truly believes that it's too fast, it's too much to abolish property taxes altogether, fine and fair enough. But you have to do more than reduce future increases. I don't know about y'all, but I'm old-fashioned this way. When I say tax cut, I expect my taxes to go lower, not just go up slower.
It is worth noting that every state in the United States does have property taxes. If Ohio were to be in a situation where this gets on the ballot and voters would approve eliminating property taxes, Ohio would be the first state to do that. There are other states that are kicking around similar measures, but none have passed any such measures. I want to remind our audience that we would love to hear your questions and comments. Please step up to the microphone if you feel so inclined. Say your name and where you're from, and we'll work you into the conversation. We have an email now from Aaron in Elyria. Aaron writes, I'd like to understand more about how properties are valued. Who gets to decide how much a property is worth? What are the criteria used to make these valuations? It seems very arbitrary, particularly if all someone is doing is looking at the house to the left and to the right and going, that seems right. How do we know there's no conflict of interest with these decision makers or some quiet plan to raise valuations in order to increase taxes? Aaron goes on to write, overall, it feels very frustrating to have valuations raised, which increase property taxes, but then, of course, by the time we go to sell our home, something tells me the valuation will suddenly go down and make it harder to sell. There's just no winning for the homeowner. So, Frank, I'd like to take this opportunity to ask you to tell us about the property appraisal process in Geauga County and how much property values have gone up in recent years.
Yeah, that's a great question, and assembled extremely well. It is incredibly complex and complicated. It is one of the biggest criticisms that my boss, Auditor Walder, has in terms of this whole appraisal process. We do a triennial every 3 years. We do a big sexennial every 6 years. And that's when appraisers go out into the field and they do appraise every home in the county. To the gentleman's point, they don't go inside, nor would I let an appraiser inside my home either, so I actually completely sympathize with that. But it is what would be considered like a street appraisal. So these appraisers go through the neighborhoods, they build that appraisal. They turn in the numbers that make the most sense based on market value and home sales and all of that. And then the county auditor's responsibility then is to simply pass that information along to the state of Ohio, and the state of Ohio ultimately determines what that number is going to be. So in our case, when we had the big sexennial appraisal back in 2023, the number that we came back with on what we believe the increase should be was a reasonable amount. The auditor passed along to the state of Ohio, and they rejected that and said it should be higher. He went back and forth and negotiated with them, and ultimately they came back at 29.5%, which was shockingly astronomical, and we could not believe it. We've seen double-digit increases since the sexennial in 2023, and much of this is based off of that 35 assessment value, the 35%, which this goes to the point earlier. Where do numbers like that come from? Where does this process come from? I think if you get some combination of a Ouija board and a horoscope and you hope things learn out right, you'll figure it out. But because I don't know. I don't know where that 35% assessment value comes from. And we've talked about, well, that's such an arbitrary number. Why couldn't it be 20%? That alone would astronomically reduce the property tax on residents within the county. So there's a lot of that is arbitrary. The process is arbitrary, and that process is flawed and has given flawed results, hence the 29.5% increase that we saw in Geauga County in 2023. And I don't think that's anything compared to the other counties in our area. We saw anywhere from 30 to 40% throughout Ohio, which just slammed taxpayers when they were not prepared for that at all, and it seemed like there was no rhyme or reason to it.
A little bit of background information as well that we learned this week at the City Club Forum last Friday, where we talked about the history of property taxes. We did learn from Ron O'Leary, who sits on the Board of Revisions in Cuyahoga County, that when businesses and homeowners get tax abatements, that works to spread taxes to other people, because the value of that tax, even if someone is not taxed on it because they've personally received an abatement, the value of that property is still considered in the area. So effectively what that does is spread the percentage that other people in that community pay, and so that gets spread around in that way. A little more baseline I want to share here when we talk about property taxes and how they're related to property values. You mentioned the 35% assessed value, so just want to share a quick detail about that there. When we talk about property values and property taxation, we're talking about mills or millage, which can be confusing for people. Investopedia explains mills this way. 1 mill equals $1 in tax for every $1,000 of a property's taxable value. Taxable value is key. This gets a little more complicated because in Ohio, people are not taxed on the full value of their property, just 35% of it. So that is the tax assessed value, 35% of whatever your property value is, hence the qualifier about property's taxable value. I'd like now to welcome our audience member to give us a question. Hello.
Sure. Good afternoon. My name is David Marinelli. I'm a resident of Lake County. Representative Smith, I am incredibly happy to see you here, sir, and I can't wait to see your next take on all of this. John, as one of your constituents who has repeatedly reached out to you and asked for an answer more nuanced than just cut spending, I'd like to address the incredibly dangerous and reckless acts the tax campaign. I don't say that to be hyperbolic. I say that as fact. If you don't like the fire department and what they're doing, you don't eliminate the fire department and hope that someone will create something else in order to come in and put someone's burning house out. If we eliminate property taxes without any kind of research, without any kind of planning, without any kind of analysis of what we do to replace that funding, you are going to create more problems. You're going to do the exact things that you said you're designed not to do, drive people out, lower property rates, all of that. I would like to hear from you what you have done as a county commissioner to reach out to the state, to your fellow commissioners across the state, to work to find a problem to the actual issue, because just cutting taxes is not going to do it. It's going to create more problems. It's going to be even worse. This is a very nuanced problem. It is a budgeting problem. It is a policy problem. And Pat, as you mentioned, just looking at schools, it's very common for people to say, oh, there's so much fraud in schools. There's not. You had put out a policy saying if we go back to the 2013 spending levels and eliminate all the fraud, then it would pay for some of the tax cuts. You would have to have nearly 30% fraud for that to happen. It's just basic math. So I would like to hear from you something rooted more in research and fact than the hyperbole and talking points that you've mentioned. So what are you doing to actively engage your constituents, to have those discussions? As you mentioned, actually a couple of folks mentioned, having that discussion with constituents to see what solutions are out there. Because I think the problem is we've had decades of policy where it's not that money isn't there. We've had surpluses in this state. The money is there. It's how we're choosing to spend the money. And as was pointed out originally, one of the big problems as to why the tax burden specifically for property tax has become so high is because we've allowed corporations to not pay their fair share. Thank you. And from a school perspective, the siphoning off of money to private schools, which is a very active policy in this state, has done its damage. We know that if you cut their money, schools have no other recourse but to go back to the taxpayers. So can you address what research, what facts, what analysis have you done beyond just cut spending?
Thank you. To your point, the money is there. And the reason why it's so important to juxtapose the numbers is to demonstrate how you can afford to abolish property taxes should the people of Ohio decide that the state legislature has not heard them and they need to simply flip the table. You wouldn't have to go back to 2013. In fact, you'd only have to go back to 2019 levels of spending to abolish property taxes entirely at the state level. You're talking about a budget of about $100 billion a year. That's the all funds budget for Ohio, not just the general fund. You put all spending into one bucket, about $100 billion a year. Property taxes, depending on who you ask, bring in between 20 to 24 billion. That's a roughly 20% cut to the state budget. And it's just important to put that in perspective. Because we talk about local services that we care about, whether it be schools or metro parks or libraries. And I'm a former library trustee. No one loves libraries more than the professor. But we have the ability to take the money. We have the ability to take the money from the state and give it back to the localities. And in fact, that's what history says we should be doing. You go back 80 years ago when the sales tax was adopted for the state of Ohio. What were its purposes? Alleviation of poverty at the county level, public schools, and local government fund. But the state kept all the money. In the 1970s, decades later, the state passed the state income tax, and they swore this time it'll be for public schools and the local government fund. But over the years, the state has kept more and more and more of the money, and as we discussed already, that trend accelerated under Governor Kasich. And now we're talking about the marijuana tax, where the state's already saying we want to keep 2/3 of it. So it's not that we don't have enough taxes, property taxes, income taxes, sales taxes, marijuana taxes, lottery, and fees. Ohio is one of the highest tax states in the union. There's plenty of money. To your own words, the money is there. It comes down to our priorities. We could afford to keep all of our local services with absolutely no cuts and abolish property taxes if we stuck it to the state and said we're going to be keeping this revenue locally. Now, I'm not saying that's the only solution, but you have to put it in perspective. You have to show people that abolishing property taxes is not impossible. It's just a matter of priority. And you could choose to keep your local services, abolish property taxes, and ultimately stick it to the state. I've often said that Ohio has really 3 fundamental options in front of us. Door number 1, we do nothing. And I would argue that's the most irresponsible, dangerous option of all. It's easy to sit here if you can afford to pay your property taxes and say, oh, well, worst case, we'll just keep doing what we're doing. Not everyone who's sitting here can afford to keep doing that. And so I would argue that the status quo is the most dangerous, but that is door number 1, do nothing and let property taxes continue to go up and up and up with inflation. Door number 2 is kind of the boogeyman we hear from Columbus, that if you abolish property taxes, we don't have roads, police, fire, schools, libraries, it's Mad Max 2.0, and we all get used to the bullet farm. I don't think anyone's excited about that future either. In fact, I think it's a straw man. No one is seriously proposing that, not the folks trying to abolish the tax or the folks on the other side. That only leaves us with door number 3, which, yes, is to cut spending at the state level, to keep more revenues local with local control, and ultimately, in a world where we're seriously discussing abolishing the income tax at the state level, which brings in over $10 billion, well, if we can afford that, surely we can afford to abolish half of property taxes. And let me close by saying this. For those of you who don't want to go the full way, well, let's talk about what we could do. You know, once again, abolishing property taxes would be 20% of the state budget, but abolishing property taxes for just seniors, for people who are 65 and older, no income limits, no value limits. We know the cost because Senator Al Catrona from Mahoning County costed it out at the state Senate. That would be less than 3%. That'd be less than 3% of the state budget. So for the folks who are hearing, we can't afford to do anything. There's no way to address this property tax issue without drastically cutting local services. I say not true. There is money there, and it comes down to priorities.
John,
So-
let's hear a little bit about what might happen. Thank you very much for your question. We appreciate it, and we're going to ask a couple of questions. If you'd like to return to the mic in the moment, we can certainly do that.
I would just like to say those are not the only 3 options, and that's why I was asking for the analysis. There is a 4th option, which is you do the work ahead of time, then you cut property taxes. That is a nuanced, intelligent solution, not just cutting property taxes and hoping that you can stick it to Ohio. Because when you say stick it to Ohio, you've just told everyone in the state of Ohio you don't care about them.
Thank you for the comment, and we will get to more
I
comments
would
from
just-
the
I
audience.
would just ask the question, how has that solution worked for us so far? When we politely ask the government, would you consider giving us some of our money back? Has anyone gotten a refund from their county or the state on their property taxes? No.
Then
It
I would
doesn't
submit to you,
work.
John, we need to change leadership, and the fact that it has been
I
would
agree.
like
We
to
do
invite
need-
our
we do
audience
need
to
to
remember that
change-
we do want to
change
abide by the
leadership.
rules
I
of the
agree.
City Club form. John, please just a moment here. We want to make sure we keep this
I'm
civil, and I do appreciate the comment. We want to make sure that everyone gets an opportunity to be heard. So
Absolutely.
I would like to direct a question to Brian now, and Brian, I'd like to ask you if you could lay out some scenarios for us. What would happen to the Cleveland Metro Parks and the zoo if property taxes were to be abolished in Ohio?
You know, I think, again, we have to look at common sense and how did we get here? And I mean, you're asking me to theorize something that could happen. You know, I think the rational person, we should have these dialogues. We should. And I think what John is trying to say is they're trying to push the envelope for a level of change with the tool that's available. Is it the best? I don't necessarily know that I agree with it, but I do understand kind of the root of it. Having said that, you know, the support that we have gotten, you know, through Cuyahoga County, when you look at the economics of a park system such as ours, it's been quantified that $873 million a year are directly related to having this system that's actually here. Those luxuries then go away or are much reduced. As John said, those are choices. Those are real, actual choices. The choices that have been made at the local level to fund the park district, when we look at the 78%, local control voted to fund the park district at this level. So when you look at options of the state, whether in Florida, Texas, Wisconsin, wherever it happens to be, you know, you're asking for a small population of elected officials to try to decide the base of what's actually going to happen. But people need to empower themselves. They need to understand what their bills are saying. Is there room to help seniors? Yeah, I mean, it seems like that makes sense. I was part of the cuts. Our organization was part of the local government cuts. I know what it did to us. It is severe. If you lose 60% of your funding, it is a severe cut. What you see today will not be what it will be in the future.
Pat, I'd like to ask you about something that you mentioned earlier, the Fair School Funding Plan, and how that plays into the conversation about school funding and property taxes. We know that the Fair School Funding Plan is not being funded to the full extent of what was provided for in those provisions. If it were to be, how does that change the picture for school funding in Ohio?
Well, it's a pretty multi-layered issue, so I'll try to address some of that. First of all, it is only partially being funded. In addition to that, they're funding it at 2025 levels, but the inputs are being funded, the spending inputs are being funded from 20 22. So therefore, the funding is being put in place without looking at inflation, without looking at increased operating costs, without looking at increased property values. We're looking at everything from 2022 spending levels. So fair school funding, in addition to that, what the public needs to realize is that Ohio Public Schools today, and I just looked this up before I came here, educate 89.9% of K-12 students in the state. That means that the close to $3 billion is going to not only 9 to 10% of the families in Ohio, but those very families, students, have never stepped foot, 80% of those students have never stepped foot in a public school. So what we're doing is we're subsidizing private for-profit schools. Now, of that money, in addition to those types of monies that are coming out of Ohio tax funds, the public schools are required to bus private school students. They're required to supply services to students with IEPs. They're required to provide tutoring service to private schools. It's not sustainable. It's simply not sustainable. And what the legislature is doing is, because remember I said that the decrease in the state share has over the last decade gone from 60% to 35%. They're forcing schools to continually going to homeowners to ask for levy money, and they're saying that the vouchers and Ed Choice are in place because parents should have a choice. Well, I believe the residents and the citizens of Ohio have made that choice, and 90% of them are choosing public schools. So they need to understand why the amount of money they are paying in levy dollars, in tax dollars, is the majority of that is going to private for-profit schools. It would be devastating for public schools.
One of the things that Pat mentioned there was IEPs, that stands for Individualized Education Programs and Plans for people who are in need of those. We'd like to welcome audience member State Senator Kent Smith from District 21, a Democrat, to the microphone. Hello, Senator Smith. Please go ahead.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much to IdeaStream for having this panel and coming out to the beautiful Cleveland Metro Park Zoo. Thank you, Brian, for hosting us. Thank you to the panel. I would say that fixing Ohio's property tax mess starts by looking at all of our taxes. Nobody in Ohio just pays property tax. People also pay sales tax and income tax. I would say everybody's tax burden is a three-legged stool, and today's property tax crisis didn't just emerge overnight. It's been 20 years in the making. And as for why Ohio is out of balance, I'm going to quote from the Ohio Children's Budget. This was published in March 2025. This is their quote. Quote, since 2005, Ohio has shifted money away from the working class families towards the wealthy and well-connected through tax cuts and special interest giveaways. As a result, the wealthiest 1% of Ohio households are now taking home, on average, over $52,000 a year in tax breaks. Ohio is also out of balance if you look at our neighboring states on the three-legged stool category. If you look at our 9 neighbors, Minnesota, New York, the Great Lakes states, and our 2 southern states, West Virginia and Kentucky, the data shows that Ohio has shifted the tax burden to sales tax and property tax payers so that those paying income tax can get another tax cut. When compared to the 9 nearby states, Ohio has the second highest property tax, the 4th highest sales tax, but the lowest income tax for those earning the most. And by the way, Ohio is one of 4 states of the 50 that has a 0% corporate income tax. So that's another revenue stream that we could be using to take some of the pressure off our high property tax rate. And the notion of the three-legged stool actually came out of my analysis of just looking at the state up north, Michigan, that dealt with this issue in the early 1990s. They had a similar problem. Their property tax burden was overwhelming. The population was angry, and they looked at those 3 criteria and rebalanced all of their taxes so they would still be competitive with their Great Lakes neighbors and still increase the amount of revenue coming into the state government, just doing it in a more fair way. And if you actually look at Michigan right now, they are average or below average in all 3 of those categories. So again, I wish I had the ear of my 131 colleagues. I think I've got some of their ears, but I think the solution that we need to look at, first of all, begins with looking at the entire tax burden and how some of the legs of the stool may be out of compliance. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Senator Smith. And I do want to continue to encourage our audience members to approach the microphone. We do want to hear from you, and we'll get to those questions as you come to the microphone. Reminder, please say your name, where you're from, ask your question, and then feel free to take your seat, and then we will get to your question of our panel. Frank, I want to ask you about the imbalance that Senator Smith was just talking about, whether that would be a way that you think would be meaningful to give relief to property owners by gaining revenue through taxing income of higher earners and businesses.
Yeah, it's a great perspective. I appreciate that. I'm a local control kind of guy. As I said, I served as a township trustee. I work in county government. I will withhold most of my comments in terms of Columbus because I'm not a huge fan of how the state government governs us on the local level. I will say that much has been discussed about property tax going away, and then when property tax goes away, the state will step in and provide alternative solutions that will help the parts of the 3-legged stool. Obviously, namely, income tax, sales tax being the 2 biggest ones, right? So I've talked to municipal leaders in our county, and they're not as worried about the property tax issue because they're very small portions of their cities or their villages are funded by property tax, right? They're getting income tax. They have other methods for that, sales tax and whatnot. And so if you look at the way that the legislature has things set up now, townships, which Ohio is still very much a township-driven state, they have no mechanism for income tax. They have no mechanism for sales tax. And I understand that, well, the legislature could just do that, but that's not the case right now. So if we were to lose the property tax leg of the stool, there is no immediate solution for fixing some of the local government issues. And again, as a former township trustee, if property tax is abolished, then on day 2, there will be no local police or fire, at least not in my township, because 80% of my township is funded by inside and outside millage. So while that may be a possibility where we can move things around and make more equitable use of income tax and sales tax and whatnot, that's not the vehicle for the vast majority of the state of Ohio, whether it be townships or even county government is capped at what they can do with that.
I think we may have an audience member with a question. Please say your name and where you're from and let us know what you'd like to talk about.
Hi, I'm Pete Van Leer. I live in Cleveland. I'm with Honesty for Ohio Education. And the senator took some of my points, but I also want to second the previous questioner about leadership. I think looking at the state's leadership, we need to do some changes. But I'll put some numbers on what the senator said. 20 years ago, we had 9 income tax brackets in Ohio. Now everybody who makes more than $26,000 pays the same flat tax. And as somebody mentioned before, they're talking about eliminating the income tax. $17 billion a year goes, more than that, every year goes to in tax breaks, loopholes, and tax cuts for corporations. That's a lot of money we could be doing something else with, or at least looking at which of those are really helping and which are not. Property taxes are the most stable. You mentioned the townships and how they rely so heavily on counties. The local government fund, I think you mentioned that's been cut over the years, and that's the state leadership, again, a problem there. But going back to your question, Mr. Plechnik, 20%, oh yeah, we could lose 20%, no problem at the state. Which of your organizations or counties would happily take a 20% cut, and how would you manage that? I mean, if you're telling the state to do that, not that there isn't some room for reform, but yeah, would you be happy to take a 20% cut in your county and in your other organizations?
I think the more important question is how many more cuts can we ask taxpayers to make? Because ultimately, when we increase taxes, we pass the buck from our table to everyone else's kitchen table. And so far, government has just raised and raised and raised the tax, and all the taxpayers have been expected to make up the difference. What's changed is that with the highest inflation in 40 years and an average increase in property values of 30%, which resulted in a double-digit increase in property taxes, about a 15% increase. This isn't a hypothetical. How would you cut 15 or 20% from your budget? We literally said to every homeowner in Ohio, you're paying about 15% more in taxes. And that's not acceptable. So do we answer that question with a 100% cut to the budget? It could. And it's important for us to put those numbers in perspective. But once again, if you believe that we should have more modest reforms and rebalance the three-legged stool, we're all ears. But what is absolutely irresponsible, what is absolutely unacceptable, is to just say, status quo, we're going to do nothing. Now, if there were a passage of the amendment to abolish property taxes, they're collected a year in arrears, which would mean even if it passed November of 2027, you'd still collect property taxes through 2028. If giving 2 years plus notice to the state that you need to plan to reduce your budget, to rebalance the tax system, if that's not enough time, then let me just say, as you've said, it's time for new leadership. 2 years is a long time. We didn't give taxpayers any time. You pay or you lose your home.
John, I'd like to ask you a follow-up question based on something you mentioned about inflation. Previously, you had said that if the government returned to levels of spending from 2019, then it would be easy to eliminate these taxes and things would be able to continue on. We have had 31% cumulative inflation since 2019, so I'm not sure that it's possible to return to 2019 level of spending. What do you say to that?
I would say it's always a bimodal question of, do we charge that increase in inflation to the taxpayer, or is government forced to operate more efficiently and effectively? And I would argue that if we're the 16th highest state in the union and we're not getting the 16th best services, that says if 2/3 of the state can do it better than we do, if 2/3 of the states are more efficient than we are, even with that inflation, there's room for the state to do better rather than put that entire increased burden on the taxpayer.
Pat, I'd like to ask you about Akron City Schools. Akron City Schools specifically have faced staffing cuts the last several years, not unique to Akron City Schools, by the way, and more expected in the next year. You've seen this firsthand. You're also co-chair of the Ohio 8 Coalition, which is made up of the biggest school districts across the state. How do educators respond when they are faced with losing staff combined with less money coming from the state, as we mentioned, related to the Fair Funding Plan, and then also talk of eliminating property taxes altogether?
Thank you. That's a great question. So yes, I am co-chair of the Ohio 8 Coalition, which are the 9 largest urban systems in the state. And we are a unique coalition. I don't believe there's another one in the country, in that we have 9 superintendents and 9 labor union presidents working together to try to solve some of these problems. So that's very important. So Akron had to implement $11 million. Now, we're a mid-size compared to Columbus or Cincinnati. We have about 20,000 students in Akron, about 4,000 employees. We had to cut $11 million from our budget last school year. This year, we're looking at cutting an additional $27 million from the budget. And in the 27-28 school year, we're looking at having to cut $35 million from the budget. We don't know how to open the doors after that. I think somebody said that, you know, the old talking point that there's all this waste in our school systems is just not true. I believe if we're going to solve some of these problems, the first thing we must do is be honest about what's really happening in the state. And it's just not sustainable in our district or any other of the public school districts. I don't think we have till 2027 to figure this out, because to cut that much money from the budget, in addition to being underfunded, in addition to having continuous layered upon layer of unfunded mandates to our public school systems, looks to many, including myself, to be a purposeful act to eliminate public education in the school. And that's just the facts. So I believe as more and more of these facts come out and more of our citizens in Ohio realize what is happening, not only with schools, but with our libraries, with our park systems, with our public services, I think that if you want to talk about a grassroots effort to change things, that's where the grassroots effort's going to be, to make people realize that the false narrative that they're being fed is not the case, and that schools and teachers and educators are trying their darndest to do what they do. But when we have politicians get in and say, oh, you're failing, when they're the ones causing the failure, and not all our politicians, we have a supermajority in Columbus, and I recognize that and appreciate those politicians that recognize what's happening. I think that that's our number one priority, to get the public made aware of what's actually in reality happening.
Brian, I'd like to ask you about the return on investment of investing in the metro parks in the face of some residents being frustrated with property taxes. What would you like to share about that?
You know, I think it's interesting, the 1 + 1 = 4 type of model. When we look at, access across, the park district, the model by which we try to find assistance through, and a great example is the Community Sailing Center, the Patrick S. Parker Community Sailing Center. We raised almost $16 million of outside funds and put $2 million. So when you start to look at solutions, we need to look at fiscal solutions that are additive like that actually give back to the community in unique ways. We have a partnership here with the Cleveland Zoological Society. On our build out for the primate forest of $70 million, they've raised almost $30 million. And so that's from the outside. So when you look at being able to leverage dollars to be able to give a rate of return is really, something that I think should be looked at. The other, thing across when you look at how money is spent, this district is 108 years old and owes no money. So we're not borrowing forward, we're not leveraging people's futures. We only spend what we can bring in, and we have to be fiscally responsible for that 10-year period of time, and that's just the fact. And if the voters don't like what we've done over 10 years, then they don't vote for the levy, and we don't exist. So I think there's some ways that you look at how organizations are run or how structurally they could be run in a little bit different modeling.
Of course, depending on the type of service, for example, not every service that is funded by property taxes has the luxury of being able to do that, but thank you for sharing that perspective with us about the metro parks. We'd like to invite our audience question.
Thank you for being here. It's been very informative. I'm Andrea from Geauga County, and just one quick comment before I have my question is, we have an election in November, and how important, and to me, if I am going to support this movement for amendment for no property, and I vote for my incumbent representative, I'm feeling like that would be rather hypocritical, because that's the people making the decisions, the people that have the power right now. But my question is, if the amendment gets on the ballot and it passes and we abolish property tax, will that be an incentive for foreign, like people outside of the state, to purchase property because of the fact that they would not be paying property tax? And would that affect our property values? It's just kind of one of those negative side effects that could happen.
Thank you. I mean, obviously, having no property taxes would make property in Ohio more valuable. That would be an incentive for anyone to purchase property in Ohio. And I would argue that one of the reasons why you should support cutting property taxes at a minimum, abolishing it at a maximum, is because we aren't growing relative to our sister states. Every census, we're losing 1 or 2 congressional seats. Ohio is supposed to be the heart of it all. We're supposed to be the mother of presidents. We're supposed to be the leader of the Midwest, and we can be again. But we certainly have to cut taxes. We have to be competitive with our sister states. If we're going to have seniors stay here for their retirement, young families come here to work, we can't be taxing more than the competition. And we are with property taxes right now. That's not up for debate. So would it incentivize everyone, whether you're from another country, another state, another city? Absolutely. But we have other countries trying to recruit our seniors. We have Panama offering discounts to U.S. retirees. I don't want to lose my seniors in Lake County to Lake County, Florida, or to another country. I want them to stay here, age in place, and be able to be with their family. But right here, right now, we're not making Ohio affordable.
We'd like to invite another audience member question, and we will try to get to as many audience member questions as possible. It's a little unclear to me where the line ends, so please step up to the microphone. Thank you.
Okay. I'm David Berenson in Cleveland Heights, Cuyahoga County. And just in relation to the last comment, there could be a disincentivizing effect of if we abolished property taxes because of the lessening services. And then that might take time for people to realize how the lack of services will affect our roads, affect our parks, affect our everything. So anyway, but my point was that I worked in non-public and charter schools for 23 years, and during that time I realized how many people who sent their kids to those schools didn't realize how much public funds went to support the services, the textbooks, the staffing of different needs in those schools. Some of them always voted against tax levies because they didn't think, oh, I'm sending my kid to a private school. So, and that goes to the question that I want to pose to the panel, because in thinking about, we have 88 counties in Ohio. I'm guessing that every county differs in how well they manage their funding, how well they manage their spending, and how much they need, as well as, like I'm in Cuyahoga County, there are definitely increased needs in a county like Cuyahoga County that people don't know they benefit from. Okay, so the question for the panel is, how do we make the case to the public for the benefits they get from taxes of all different levels that they don't necessarily realize they directly benefit from?
Thank you for the question. Pat, do you have a response to that?
Again, it's multi-leveled. So the question was, how do the citizens know how their public dollars are being spent? Is that, again, some of the ownership is on the public, and now we need to do a great job of laying the facts out and informing the public. But certainly, school systems are there to ask questions. We have school board meetings, we have city hall meetings, we have many avenues that people can seek out solutions. I believe, you know, God bless America, when you go to the polls, you should vote for whom you feel is a candidate in your best interest, but only after you have educated yourself on what that candidate stands for. And I think the public is getting that message, and I do believe the next number of elections you will see a turnout where people are voting based on really home-hitting issues rather than some of the things they've been voting for in the past.
I'd like to welcome our next audience member question, please.
Terrence from Lakewood, Ohio. Ohio's been losing population for the last half century. At one time we had, 23 or 24 representatives? Now we're down to 15. So the solution is 50 years old. But my property taxes, 76% go to schools and municipalities. The school system seems to be doing an adequate job. Getting rid of the real estate taxes, what would that do? Municipality seems to be doing a decent job. What would that happen to the, you know? And number three is neither governmental candidate in May said they had no solution to the elimination of the property taxes. That was May. I know that's 8 weeks ago, but they didn't have a solution, and they're running to be our governor. And so that's what it is. It's what are we going to do to have good services in the municipalities, and what are we going to do to have a good school system? Because an old real estate broker told me, so goes the schools, so goes your home. If you don't have a home that is valued, and you're not going to have a good school system.
Thank you for that. Frank, I'd like to ask you, are there reforms that you particularly, specifically, would like to see happen with property taxes?
Yeah, I appreciate that. First of all, I'll say, again, I live in a township. I'm a taxpayer. I have a very high property tax bill. I have a daughter. Her name is Juliana. She's sitting over there. Juliana, can you say hi to us? It's my 11-year-old there. So we live in a public school district. I make the choice to send my daughter to private school and pay for that. I'm happy to pay for our local school district because it is good for my community. A lot of concerns I have are that there are more than just the three options we've talked about here. I think reform is the most important option we need to discuss. I think the state legislature has made a, how can I say this, Potemkin effort at it the past 6-9 months now. It's been a college try to show us that they're doing something, but I think the commissioner mentioned it. Everything is pretty much forward-facing. Nothing has been immediate relief here. They've given locals some of the abilities, I know Lake County has done this, to enact some legislative provisions that take a little bit of the burden off of seniors and some homestead stuff, but that's actually a very small fix the legislature has done. I think in terms of when I look at my property tax bill, 70%, actually in Geauga County, it is actually 69.9% of property taxes in Geauga County are outside millage. What is outside millage? That are levies that are voted on by the taxpayers. The rest of it comes from a combination of inside millage, the 20 mil floor, and then some other state things. I think that there needs to be a very serious discussion in terms of looking at reform on abolishing inside millage. I think that's the one that's not voted on. Well, it's not that I think. It is not voted on by local taxpayers. It is somehow conceived by the state of Ohio, and then somehow that money goes to the state, comes back, and they get their piece of it and whatnot. So that is not a local control piece. I think the 20 mil floor, we could sit here all night and try to explain that, and this is that whole piece I talked about before where you'd need a Ouija board and a magic ball to explain that. The 20 mil floor is incredibly complicated for schools. The state legislature already understands that school funding, as it is right now, is unconstitutional and has not done anything about it for decades. So I think that starting off in terms of reform, inside millage needs to be addressed. I think the way that we allow property taxes to go on the ballot in terms of some levies, we do allow some levy shopping, so to speak, where entities will look at what they think the most advantageous time is, where maybe there's low turnout and they can pump money into it and get something passed. I think that the 50% plus one in terms of passing a levy is something that should be discussed. I think there's other pieces too, and the state legislature has fortunately looked at emergency levies and some continual levies and some things that shouldn't exist. I have a ton of respect for Lake in terms of what the zoo has done in not having continuing levies, not having these emergency levies, but putting the 10-year out there and then having to justify it again. And then lastly, I think that the local budget commission should have more authority to hold local agencies accountable for how they're spending the money and for in terms of what the need is that's being presented, and then having to justify that need to the budget commission as well. So I think there's a lot of reform that can be looked at that can be that help that burden while also still keeping local control for people who are voting on these levies.
Follow-up note to our question from our audience member, I want to share that we do know that Democratic candidate for governor, Dr. Amy Acton, did release a property tax plan. This was just yesterday, and it included some proposals, including expanding the homestead exemption. For those who are not aware, the homestead exemption is related to seniors' household income, and there's a threshold at which a portion of the property value will not be taxed in order to benefit seniors who have been in their homes for a certain amount of time, shields a portion of that property value. And we would also like to share that Republican candidate for governor Vivek Ramaswamy, on his website, it says that Vivek will deliver immediate relief by rolling back property tax levels to where they were before the end of the COVID-19 pandemic. We don't have additional detail about that, but that is what is listed on the website. I see we have a few people in line here. We are closing in on an hour for this conversation. We will get to everyone who is in line. Next audience member question, please.
Romano Grilli. Property taxes is almost like socialism, leasing your property from the government.
Can I ask you to step a little closer to the microphone, please? Having a hard time hearing you.
Hello?
Thank you.
My name is Romano Grilli. Property taxes is almost like socialism, leasing your property from the government. Individuals can spend the money the way they want and support organizations they want themselves. And to support the losses, maybe a gasoline tax or license plate tax or sales tax exempting real estate, though. That's all I got to say.
Thank you for sharing the comment. John, I'd like to ask you a question about this. One of your colleagues who is in support of the Axe Ohio tax, his name is Brian Massey, and he's described property tax as a burden on liberty. I don't know if you share this philosophy, but in May at a presentation in Midfield, Massey said that property taxes make residents, quote, serfs to the government. What do you think about that argument for the abolishment of property taxes?
I think it's a strong analogy. Ultimately, you're paying rent to the government to stay in your own home. The governor of Florida said, when you buy a television set, you don't have to make a payment to the government every month to keep it and to watch it. You buy it and you're done. You pay sales tax when you purchase it, and it's over. The home is kind of an odd exception to that rule where you have to pay tax, pay tax, pay tax. We've heard from so many people this election, and I agree, no kings. We beat King George III. But what did kings do but charge the peasants to stay on the king's land? And property taxes bear a strong analogy to that. We have to be honest with ourselves. You don't truly own your property if you can be kicked off of it when you fail to pay. And we have to look at reforms to make it harder for the government to take your property away, even if property taxes stay. There has to be reforms to that effect. Otherwise, you are just renting from the government. You are a serf.
John, thank you for clarifying your stance on that portion of the argument against property taxes. Our audience member question, please.
Okay, I have a couple of comments I'd like to make. First of all, no offense to the Cleveland Municipal School District, but I resent paying 60% of my property taxes to an institution that I have absolutely no use for and never had. I once went to a school building to vote, and that's the extent of my relationship with the school district. But my primary concern, other than that, because I know most of you people have family members that are in school and you want to continue to support the local school district, and I have no problem with that, but my big concern is the market valuation. In 2024, my market valuation went up from $113,500 to $329,900. I made Channel 5 afternoon news that year because of that. It was ridiculous. I currently have it down. Let's see if I want to get my figures right. I currently have it down to $199,500. I went to the Board of Revision. I had an appraiser that I paid $450 for out of my own pocket, never reimbursed. And now it's down to $199,500. But that's still 175% over the previous market value before 2024. And my concern is that there should be a limit imposed on how high market values can increase without just cause. I mean, if you go over 30% of previous market value, you should have a reason to do that. Now, in some cases, there probably is a good reason for that. In my case, I don't see it because I see other property in my neighborhood, one less than 200 feet away from my house here, that's valued at $165,000. Much better condition, about the same size. The garage is in excellent condition. My garage is condemned by the city of Cleveland.
So if-
Thank you for sharing that, John. Go ahead, and then I
So
have
if
a question for
could-
Frank.
If I could jump in, first, a little piece of good news. Last year, the state legislature did pass a reform where property values cannot go up higher than inflation. I would argue that's not enough in a world where inflation can go up 30% in a handful of years. I would argue that the best reform to address your particular concern is to adopt legislation along the lines of Proposition 13 from California, where we set property values at sales price. It's an objective value, what a willing buyer paid a willing seller, and it doesn't go up until you sell your property. There's a second benefit to that. Not that I want to fire my colleague here, but we have a lot of government employees that do nothing but value properties. And at the county and state level, we could save a lot of money by saying that whole function goes. No more government in the valuation of homes business. Instead, we just set property value at sales price, done.
If I could jump in
Yes,
real quick
please,
with that.
Frank.
I absolutely agree with that. This is one of my biggest complaints. Capping it is insufficient. I don't understand why my property value went up simply because my neighbor down the street sold their house and that value went up. I haven't done anything to fix up my house so it's sale ready. Believe me, my microwave doesn't even work right now, right? So there's all these people with these homes out there and their valuation is being dictated by somebody else's sales price, not their sale price, and the home isn't worth that. So I appreciate that you had the ability to do the Board of Revision process.
I have 3 rooms in my house that have absolutely no electricity.
Yeah, I understand that. I agree with the commissioner on this one. Sales price is demonstrative of the value of what a home is worth based on what a willing buyer wants to buy it for. Absolutely.
Thank you for that. I think we have another audience member question, and this will be our final audience member question. Please step up to the microphone.
My name is George. I'm from Lake County, and I'm here to apply to everyone about what made this country great. It was freedom, the ability to vote, and less taxes. We didn't grow up with taxes. And one, from an educational standpoint, the federal government has done away with competition or with monopolies. You're a monopoly. What's wrong with competition? Competition, I grew up in competition, football, wrestling, and that's what made the best rise to the top. That's going to make you better, not worse. And secondly, on the education part, how many school districts do we have in this state? Anyone know? 600 plus. How many superintendents do we have? 600 plus. My local superintendent, if you look closely, he makes more than probably most of us in this. He makes $235,000 a year. He never steps into a classroom. He writes flowery types of letters to the citizens. What are we doing about eliminating some of those, or combining? That's a solution. Combine some of the 600, take it down to 300. You do away with all that administration and the superintendents. That's one solution you're looking for. So we have 300 schools. No, you don't like it.
I would like to ask our panelist, Pat, if she would like to respond to what's being stated here, please.
I would. Thank you for your observations. So I believe we should have competitive school districts. We're not fearful of the competition, but we have to have competition. We have to have a fair and level playing field. So currently, our public schools are underfunded and also are required to pay for private schools in many areas. Our private schools, private, parochial, charter schools, are not held accountable to the same standards, have no accountability with how they spend public tax dollars, have no accountability with what they teach, same thing with the educators they have. We have to have licensed professional educators in public schools. In many cases in the private schools, they're not required to do that. And if you want to have true competition and see the results of that, you have to have a level playing field, and it is not in any way, shape, or form a level playing field.
Who set those rules? The state?
The state,
Then
yes.
your enemy is the state. You need to go after the state for that.
I would
And what is
say,
the OAA doing
I would like
about the
to
state?
remind our audience member, we do appreciate if you can ask the question and then we'll let the panelists
Another
respond.
question.
We don't usually do a typical
All right.
follow-up back and forth.
Another question. With regard to the libraries, Our local library just purchased a $265,000 Winnebago bookmobile. I don't get it. If they need,
Thank you for sharing that. Unfortunately, we don't have your local library here, so we can't address that particular issue right here. That will be the final audience question. We do appreciate it. We're going to wrap things up here. I know there has been some enthusiastic conversation here among the members of our audience, and I do encourage people to stick around after this is over, for just a bit, for a reasonable amount of time, so that you can have those conversations with each other. I would highly encourage that. We have a final question here for our panel before we wrap things up. I would like to ask everyone in a few sentences to respond to this question. As we look towards the future, Ohioans will be voting on a new governor soon. What would each of you like to see from a new administration when it comes to property taxes? I'll start with Frank.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you, Stephanie. I want to see what we'll probably get from neither candidate, because we've not seen this from a governor in the state of Ohio since certainly John Kasich or before that. But again, as a local control person, I want to see the state, which it's funny to even say this, but push more control to the local governments. I can call right now my township trustee, Jim, and I can yell at him for the resurfacing project they're doing on my street right now, and there is zero chance I can get a hold of anybody in the governor's office. I know the county engineer. I don't even know who the director of the Ohio Department of Transportation is right now. So I would love to see more local control pushed down, less state interference. My biggest concern with moving forward on any kind of an abolition piece is that if we take local control away from the locals, we give that to Columbus, all of a sudden Columbus has much more power and leverage over the locals. And if Columbus becomes the replacement banker, then Columbus becomes the decision maker for the locals. And I like to be able to yell at my local township trustees.
Thank you for that, Frank. John, in a couple sentences, please.
I'd like to see immediate property tax relief, and I believe that both gubernatorial candidates should stop campaigning, go to the state legislature, and not leave until our property taxes are cut. And I would say three things to that. Number one, 100% property tax exemption for our seniors. 65 years of paying taxes is enough, and it only costs 3% of the state budget to do it. Number two, Prop 13. From now on, no more valuation of our homes going up with inflation. Sales price is property value. That's simple, that's fair, and it saves a lot of money. And number three, we've talked a lot about the public schools. They were meant to be the great equalizer. They were meant to give every kid the same opportunity. The reason why the Ohio Supreme Court held our funding system unconstitutional is because it provides uneven funding for different public schools. The reason why Article 6, Section 2 of the Ohio Constitution says the state legislature shall fund the common schools is so that we give each child an equal opportunity. By the way, I hate to warn you, that doesn't mean more. It means fair. It means every school district gets the same dollar amount per child. You shouldn't have more or less because you're in Cuyahoga versus Lake, or Willoughby East Lake versus Wickliffe, or Riverside school districts. Every child should get the same amount. And how do we have competition? You have the same rules apply to any private school that wants that money, and the money follows the child. Schools shouldn't be raising taxes. If they want more revenue, bring in more students. If you have less students, cut spending, and the state should fund public schools so that every child gets an equal opportunity.
Brian, how about for you? What would you like to see?
It's interesting you ask about one person in one position, but it isn't just the governor. When you look at elections across the state, we have a choice with our vote. So yes, there will be a governor's election. Yes, there will be state reps. Yes, there will be state senators. Your voice matters, and you have to use it for good. And if it bothers you, vote. And if it bothers you, educate yourself. It isn't just one person that's going to fix this. So I don't think the panacea is one governor, one room. It's the voice of the people have to move forward.
Thank you for that, Brian. And Pat, how about for you?
So I believe that public schools, libraries, local government, parks, they're the backbone of our local communities. And they're what a thriving local community means, a thriving state. I believe that the way to equalize education, and you're absolutely correct, I think it's society's responsibility to equally and equitably, which does not mean the same, it means fairly, fund our public schools, and the Fair School Funding Act was meant to do just that, the actual cost of educating a child in the state of Ohio. Again, I believe in competition, but it has to be a level playing field. And if the private schools, parochial schools, charter schools are held to the same accountability standards as our public schools are, then we'll see where the fair competition ends up. So I agree, we have to educate ourselves. The biggest thing the public can do now is educate yourselves and vote. That's your right, that's your responsibility in this country. And I believe that in the end, the public will show what their opinions are. Thank you.
That brings us to the end of this Sound of Ideas community tour discussion on property taxes. Thank you to our guests, Frank Antonucci, John Plechnik, Brian Zimmerman, and Pat Scheib. I'd like to say a special thank you to Jacqueline Lapine and Aaron Kupchak from the Cleveland Metro Park Zoo for helping set up the event and welcoming us into their space. Also to our live audience, thank you for your input in making this an engagement conversation. Round of applause for yourselves, please. For more in-depth and engaging conversations, you can tune into The Sound of Ideas Monday through Friday at 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. on 89.7 WKSU. You can also listen to The Sound of Ideas podcast wherever you get your podcasts. You can hear this very discussion again this Wednesday, July 22nd, 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. on WKSU. You can also check out the podcast version, which will go live that day wherever you get your podcasts. In case someone you think might be interested in this conversation, you can share that with them. You can also find us on video on Spotify and on YouTube. We would love for anyone here and anyone listening to this or watching this right now, tell us where the community tour should go next, who we should be talking to, and what we should be talking about. You can email us at soi@ideastream.org or message us on Instagram at The Sound of Ideas. This is The Sound of Ideas. I'm Stephanie Haney. Thank you for keeping the conversation going. I'll see you soon.